Hello and welcome to Driven by Doing podcast. Today we have a special guest from Chicago, from Evanston, and we are with Karen Demorest, Executive Director of Youth Job Center, one of our customers of UpSquad. Karen, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Absolutely. So tell us a little bit more about Karen, yourself, Karen, and how you came into nonprofit space, and you had a lot of different careers throughout your journey. So let us go back where it all started. So where you are from and give us that storyline, how you came to Youth Job Center.
Absolutely. I'd love to share that. I grew up on the West Coast. I grew up in Seattle, Washington, back in the day when Seattle was really a resource town, working class town, Boeing, docks, steel, long before it was the tech epicenter that it is today. And never in my life would have guessed that I would be in youth workforce development. I actually am first generation college graduate, and I finished later in life when I was in my 40s. So I spent about 20 years working in the restaurant and hospitality industry. And then totally by accident, I transitioned into the computer industry and found out, surprise, that I had an aptitude for programming. So this foundation of work that I did before I actually completed my higher education is something I think about a lot now in the work that I do, that oftentimes the skills that I use every day are ones that I really honed in the restaurant business. And also the fact that I learned that learning happens everywhere. It happens in the workplace, it happens in the classroom, it happens in communities, and that we really need to embrace that concept as we support young people. So then after I went to finish my undergraduate and then did my master's, I got involved in nonprofit world, first in education and now youth workforce development, which feels like it's the perfect fit for me. So that's the short story of how I got to this work.
Oh, that's amazing. And if the listeners don't know about Karen and her background, the fun fact about Karen is she actually drove, she took a trip across the country when she was 22 years old. Tell us a little bit more about that, Karen. What happened there?
Yes, that is something that is just a treasured memory of mine. So as I said, I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, and our summer vacations were camping in Eastern Washington, and I'd never seen anything. So as I was emerging as a young adult, I worked in restaurants and I saved money, and a friend of mine and I took my 1967 Plymouth Valiant and we drove around the country over a period of 5 months and worked along the way. We had some friends we stayed with. We often slept in the car and showered at state parks back in the day when you could do that thing. And it's an experience that I value so much, mostly because it was a confirmation of two things: that people are good everywhere you go, for the most part. You just find that human interactions can be really positive in so many ways. The second thing is that I was really surprised at how every place we went across the country had something. You can make assumptions about what a place is going to be like, but there's often these hidden jewels that you would never anticipate. So for example, I never would have thought about Iowa as a place that is beautiful, knowing what I knew growing up, but the rolling hills and the green and the corn and the farmland, it's just got its own beauty, and the people are really hardy too. So
that's just amazing. Thanks for sharing that with us, Karen, today. Because sometimes we make so many assumptions unless we really experience it, we couldn't really know the truth about so many things. And just having an opportunity to travel across the country and experiencing it at that early age, sometimes also could open up so many doors for us to trying to learn more about ourselves. So that's really wonderful that you're able to do that.
Absolutely.
So now coming to the next segment here, what is the best advice that you have received very early on in your career that you could actually share with us?
Well, I actually if you don't mind me modifying my response a little bit, I'd like to share my favorite quote, which
Absolutely.
is, it's attributed to Maya Angelou, and it is, "You find your path by walking it." And I think for myself, I look at how this path emerged in ways I never would have anticipated. I think for young people, we put a lot of pressure on them to define a path when they don't have enough information or experience to really think about what is a good fit for them and what they really want. And so the realization, interestingly, is that that quote is great and much, much easier in the rearview mirror when you're looking back at your life and you found your path by walking it. But when you're thinking about young people and how we can create that continuous learning, that embracing change because it will happen, and really understanding how to navigate twists and turns would be so valuable. So that's maybe one of the most valuable quotes I've ever heard.
That's great advice as well, Karen, because a lot of youth, especially now coming out of college, or sometimes like people might not even have an advantage to go to college. And I always feel that like if they know somebody in their family or friends who have taken that path before them, and if they could just guide them or just share an advice, that would actually go a long way. And not a lot of people have that leverage at that very early stage. So some of the work that UJob Center has been doing for years has been exactly trying to solve that problem, is to like really help youth in those areas to be able to like really get the right advice at the right time, because there is so much power to it. Because at that early stage, if somebody get to know about a job opportunity, get to know about how to create their resume and apply for a job, is can be a life changing for so many people.
You know, you're bringing up such an important point that I didn't learn until later in life, and it's the critical importance of our networks and the people that we have access to. So someone that has been in that type of a role or experience that can share, and there's a huge inequity in how young people have access to people with information and have served in different roles in our society. And so being able to have that information is not very fairly distributed.
I mean, like just from my own personal experience, like I'm originally from India, and that has been my challenge too. Even though there were like so many people in my family who got educated, well educated before me, and I always had this challenge, like, hey, like if there is somebody whom I can go and ask, because everybody might not have the same background. People might just get to know about things that they might actually see in a TV or just maybe listen from somebody else. Other than that, like the awareness is like the world is changing so rapidly, and sometimes even education is not at pace with how things are going in the world. So how would you like really bridge that gap until unless like you have got people in your network? And you raised a great point saying that sometimes we don't necessarily know the value of our network and how we could actually tap into those networks to be able to get the help and support that we need.
Yeah, you know, it's one of the things that I think about regularly is we keep looking for easy solutions to really complicated challenges. And we need to be more aware that it's going to take more aligned and concerted efforts to really address these things across systems. So like, for example, when you talk about education system, when I worked in a nonprofit in education, it became very clear to me that a lot is piled on an education system to address. Sometimes so much that it's really hard to prioritize everything that they need to prioritize. So like, as we're thinking about our work, which is now we want to help young people think about career options and the full breadth. So ones that require a college degree, ones that don't require a college degree, one that might be a training program, but all paths that lead to careers. And we can't just pile that on the education system for them to do. And yet, it is the place and the access point where we need to get information to students. So I think one of the things we've been trying to do in our work is partner with schools and partner with school systems to think about how can we get information to these young people, and then how do we connect with them so that if they want more information, want more help, are interested in something that they've never heard of before, like maybe working in HVAC systems, which is a real growing field. So there's a variety of things that we could do in partnership, and we have examples of it, and we have some really strong partnerships, and yet it's hard to do that work collectively. It's hard to do that at a systems level where we actually, across all education systems, have a strong partnership so young people have this information. And the other complicated piece of that is, I think about the phrase, what cuts through the noise? We throw so much information at young people. There's this, there's that, there's social media, there's this, and now they need to think about college, and they need to do their FAFSA and apply for a variety of things. How do we make our communications to students and families strategic and cohesive and aligned so that they actually can hear what options exist for them and then connect to things that are of interest to them?
Wow, because like you mentioned a couple of things there. Again, the partnership between the education systems and so many organizations that are trying to bring more and more resources, and sometimes it could be overwhelming for students as well, because at the same time they're trying to get so much, and we could only do a little piece of it. And there is so much at the same time, there is this rapid pace that everything else that's moving around us. So it just could be overwhelming for so many people. Thanks for how sharing about how these different systems could work together in order to bridge some of those gaps that we talked about.
Right.
That's super important.
It is. It is.
So now coming to the Youth Job Center and your role at Youth Job Center, Karen, tell us a little bit more about the program specifically Youth Job Center offers to the community.
So in plain speak, we are a youth workforce development agency, which means we try to help young people into the workforce. That can look a lot of different ways. When I first came in, it's been about 7 years. We were expanding. We were founded in Evanston and we're expanding into Chicago, which we've continued to do. But we were also expanding how we were thinking about jobs. There are two things that we have really grabbed onto recently in terms of priorities. We know that helping young people get a job is valuable, and especially first jobs are really important. A successful first job experience can set a different trajectory. Research shows it can lead to a reduced likelihood of unemployment and higher wages throughout a lifetime. So that is an important piece. But we also know that's not enough. And especially when we have young people that are coming in that need to or want to work, and they're looking for a job, and an entry-level job is going to be their first step. We also know it needs to not stop there. So making sure that they have the opportunity and the access to continue and to learn about how they can grow either in that job or by leaving that job. That in reality, we want to help young people move to a place where they are making a living wage, it's a meaningful career, and they're taking pride in their contribution to society, whatever the path is that got them there. So that's one of the pieces that we're really focusing on, is that career should be driven. There are many ways to get to a career, many paths to a career, but the career should be driven by what young people need, want, are interested in, and then the path unfolds from that, versus the very well-intended effort for all young people to go to college, which has had unintended consequences of both young people struggling with too much student debt, incompletion of credentials, and also the other thing is devaluing really important careers in our society that do not require college. So thinking about what are all the careers in our society? How do they all contribute to all of our well-being? and what does each young person want and what's a good fit for them.
I mean, like you raised so many great points right there, Karen. You talked about the importance of having a successful first job because that could actually set the tone for their entire career. And you also talked about how could we like really set that tone for like these youngsters who are coming in, because you talked about student debt, because that's a huge issue we all know, like across the world. It's not just here in the US, like how to really provide that valuable education that could set them for their entire career and life. And at the same time, you brought up a great point, asking a question around, do we really know what kind of jobs need a degree versus jobs that don't necessarily need a degree? Because things have been changing for the last 2 decades. There is so much technology that has evolved. May not necessarily need a degree, because that's what some of the companies have been proving us, where there are so many boot camps where people could actually learn a skill over a period of 6 months to 1 year, which they could immediately implement and get a job at a tech company, for example. Of course, there are other areas in healthcare, and so many other companies that have been leveraging and creating that human capital is super key for not just the communities, but for the overall economy. Do you think we are in the right direction in that path, or what else organizations could do in order to really leverage that area?
I think we're seeing a shift that's really valuable. I think we are seeing education systems in particular recognize that in trying to help set every young person up for success, they need to give them choice, and they need to give them choice that fits their needs or interests. So when I think about my college experience, I finished it when I was twice as old as most of the other students. And it was initially very intimidating. And very quickly, I learned that those 20 years of work I'd been doing gave me an edge. It also gave me an appreciation for what I was doing in a way that I will always cherish. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend that my path is the way for people to go. But I do think that if we embrace this concept of learning happens everywhere, and we get to learn on the time frame and time scale that works for us, that every young person can carve out something that fits their needs. They can work, they can go to college later, they can work and go to college over a period of multiple years. There are so many ways it can be constructed, but it needs to free up from the next step criteria, because that's where we've seen young people suffer. And so for our agency, we're trying to make sure that they're moving toward a career and that they're on a path to continue to grow, and that they will navigate changes. And so they need training, they need support, and they need to just know they're going to be able to do that.
Wow, I think just providing all those resources that you talked about is super critical. And Job Center is actually doing a lot of that stuff that you just talked about to really bring those resources to those people who might not have access otherwise. So my next question to you is, how do we actually measure the impact of such programs? Because sometimes a lot of community members, it's always, there is a paradox, right? There is maybe there are investments coming in, people might not really see the impact or the potential that it could make. So how do you measure that impact, Karen? Because that's what a lot of organization wants to know, is trying to understand what are those key KPIs or metrics that organization need to look into. Because if we could actually do it so well in one community, we could literally replicate that across every other community and create a great impact. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, so the impact, I think that it's a really exciting part of the work. It's also a very difficult part of the work, because ultimately we're trying to get to a positive, lasting impact for a young person where they are on a trajectory where they are going to be economically and psychologically stable, self-sufficient, moving forward in their life. And depending on the circumstances, that is not always a linear path. It looks different for a 16-year-old than it does for a 23-year-old who may have been struggling for a bit. So So we do a lot of personalization. So our measurements, actually, ultimately, our goals are those true north goals of we're helping that person to that place where they are in a job career trajectory that's going to keep them moving forward. Along the way, there are a lot of other things that we have to measure, and it's everything from what we do to how they respond. And so we have as you well know, we have a lot of trainings. We've got a really incredible training department. We've got a work readiness training that's a standard model, but we also have a menu of options where we can customize. We have a customized retail. We have different ones we customize in partnership with Chicago Public Schools, for example. And so we've been able to, with our training department, work with different organizations to customize based upon what they need. And so then there's a lot of ways of measuring the impact of that. What do young people take away from that? You know, it's much more advanced than the old pre and post. I will say one of the things that's tricky in a small nonprofit is doing the data right without it becoming the tail wagging the dog. And let me give you an example. When I first came in, I knew nothing about workforce development. And so I was really surprised at, what we were counting. Of course, we were counting how many people we served, and we were counting how many people we placed. And as we dug into numbers, they were just way more complicated than those simple numbers we like to look at. So they weren't always unduplicated. Someone could be in multiple programs. Someone could have been placed 2 or 3 times throughout a year. So you really have to have layers of data to understand if your impact is actually moving them towards. So I would say we spent a good 3 to 4 years looking at our data to figure out how we had to hold ourselves accountable. And it's always a moving target. We're always learning new things about, we realized this didn't get us where we needed to get, so we need to think differently about that. Fortunately, we've grown enough as an agency. We now are able to have, we have a quality data system. We have a quality data person, always struggles in a small nonprofit. But so we're moving in that direction really effectively. And I think that that's a critical part of what all agencies need to do. And the other thing I would say about that is we have to constantly be evolving in that. So for example, this last year, we've started integrating in more metrics around equity, which is a critical part of our work. Most of the population we serve are Black and Brown, and we've got a diverse staff. We're working towards greater diversity on our board. There's a variety of ways we need to think about how we're building equity for our clients, for our staff, for our community, and that matters what you count around that.
Great things that you just shared with us, Karen, because equity is super important, especially for people who might not have otherwise the resources. And one thing that you mentioned is there is a lot of programming on a daily basis that your job center and your folks and your team puts up, a lot of great content, great webinars, great events, and how do you engage youth? Because we can have a lot of programming. Sometimes the challenge would be on the other side as well. How do you actively engage this youth to come back again and again to really encourage them in that direction that we want them to go?
Well, that is actually one of the hardest things, is convincing young people that we are going to be of value when they don't know who we are. We try a lot of approaches. So I think one of the things I would say is that we're in the relationship business. That for us to actually be strong and supportive in helping young people on the path they need to go, they have to trust us, they have to know us. And that doesn't happen through marketing materials. That doesn't happen just because someone gives them a phone number and says, call this person. That happens because of human interaction. And as you might imagine, that's been a little more complicated in the pandemic. But so that's where we really rely on partnerships. We rely on partnerships with schools to be in schools to access students. We also rely on partnerships for our out of school youth so that we work together with agencies to refer across agencies, and referring, again, not just saying, here, take this phone number and go call this person, but really like, let me tell you who to call and why this person will help you. And so that kind of interwoven web of support is what's critical to get and keep young people engaged. And then once we have the opportunity to engage them, then it's on us. Then we need to give them quality service, personalized advising, effective training, and continue to work to serve them.
Wow, I think just so many programming and collaboration is super important. That's what I kind of like learned from what you just mentioned with other partners, and giving context to the youth, like why it is so important and how this is going to like really help them even before they actually really knowing what they could get offered in these programs, which is also very important. Now, you talked about partnerships and collaborations with so many other great organizations in your community and across Chicago. So there are organizations such as Cradle to Career or Youth and Opportunity United and Eliminating Racism, YWCA, and then work ethic programs. Like, how do you collaborate, especially with these organizations, Karen, in Evanston? Because every organization, if I just like looked at what they're doing, is like they are kind of like trying to do and work towards the similar goals, but in a way they are kind of like also have those specific programs or events that they kind of like also wants to do. So how do you collaborate with all these organizations in Evanston?
Well, it's one of the benefits of Evanston. So we were founded in Evanston, and then we're also in Chicago. And so we have different collaborations in Evanston than we have in Chicago. The beauty in Evanston is, and I hope I don't offend people from Evanston, but it's relatively a small town. And so there's, the people you're working with. You sit in meetings with the executive directors of other organizations or the superintendent or a variety of others that you need to collaborate with. So we have the opportunity to build those relationships a little more easily just because of the proximity we have to each other. The other thing about Evanston is we have a lot of good resources in this town. So there are a lot of agencies trying to do good work. There are some exceptional leaders, I would say, in this town, really rethinking about how we work together, thinking about ultimately the work that we are trying to do cannot be done by any one of our agencies alone. So we have some good traction in Evanston in terms of, working with groups of other organizations or with schools or with partners to keep working towards the solutions that are going to make a really effective and fair society across the region. And in Chicago, we've actually had, interestingly, some other areas for partnership. It's bigger, it's more complex, it's more complicated. You don't have that same access to people in quite the same way, but we've had some really effective partnerships through schools, and I think part of that, it demands leaders that are willing to evolve and change and redirect their work a little bit if it turns out that ultimately partnerships can be more effective together than separately, because we all kind of want to bring the slice of the pie. This is what we do, and let's all fit together and make it work. But in reality, there are either gaps or redundancies in that aren't necessarily serving the young people or the participants in the way that we want to. So having the courage to think about like, if we need to do this differently, how can my agency or your agency or our agencies together think differently about how we're doing this model? And that's where we've seen some really exciting progress in some of our partnerships, both in Chicago and Evanston.
That's just awesome, because like as you mentioned, like just everybody's trying to achieve the same goal, and just it is so powerful coming together. And you also mentioned great leaders who are visionaries who could really bring all people together, because they know exactly how to solve these problems. And if you just work together, that's even more powerful. So thanks a lot for sharing that, how you partner with other organizations and how you could actually benefit by doing so. And my next question to you, Karen, is, I mean, we have been still going through pandemic, and it's been so painful for so many communities across US and beyond. So during this time in the last 18 months or so, what are some of the challenges that you job center, especially in your role, has to overcome during pandemic, and how do you make those pivots over this period of time to really excel throughout your programming?
Yeah. Well, I will just shout out the YJC staff because they have been phenomenal. It has been for us and for every other agency. It's been a tap dance. It's been, how do we keep finding, supporting, helping people? And we did a very rapid transition to virtual training and initially virtual career advising, which we're still doing quite a bit of, and virtual job placement. And we've got a virtual job fair coming up in a couple weeks, October 14th. So there's a lot of the virtual that got integrated in very quickly. And I would give full credit to the team for doing a super fast turn and saying, we're going to do it this way. And then we just keep evolving and making it better. I think there are many ways in which it has both been harder and easier. So and as we emerge from this, which can't be soon enough for me, we will be a hybrid. We have found value in our virtual training in terms of providing greater access to people, the opportunity to have deep training in a virtual format has been absolutely great, partly because we've got such a good team, as I said. But we can expand on that and continue to serve more people because of the virtual training. The places where we need to have, where I think we have struggled in being able to get what we wanted to accomplish, is it's really hard to build relationships virtually. Once we have those relationships in place, virtual isn't bad. We have our board meetings virtually now, and we will never go back to every board meeting being in person because they're way more efficient. We still have fun, but we get the job done in a more effective way. But in terms of getting to know each other, and especially when we think about our young people, many of whom we're going to get to know them over a period of time. It'll take time to understand, both for us and for them, maybe what their interests are, where their strengths are, where they want to go, that development of that relationship. Some of that being in person adds so much more value. Being able to, simple things like look each other in the eye, like you technically can't do that on Zoom. So there's so many things about this pandemic that have created learnings, and there have been some blessings. We had remote workers. We had workers in staff in partnership sites and schools. So we were used to people being in different places. I think we all miss the opportunity to be together. Our office is open, but we max out how many can come in at a time. We're still being quite cautious to make sure everybody's safe. And the concept of just all being in the same room and sharing a lunch, I think would just be so much fun for all of us.
The virtual can never beat the in-person experience, Karen, as you rightly mentioned, because there is always that in-person feeling or the in-person touch that you could never feel in a virtual world. But as you rightly mentioned also, if you have that relationship built already, and then there are much efficient ways in order to do some of the parts and pieces of the overall program, which is super cool. And now, since you mentioned about the overall virtual component to it, how did you leverage technology during this period to really, because we have heard from your team members over the last 1 year that you're able to expand some of the programming because of the virtual component. So tell us a little bit more about leveraging technology during this time to be able to really expand beyond what you're able to do pre-pandemic?
Well, I would say, first off, I just want to say thank you to you and UpSquad, because we are a constantly learning, constantly evolving organization. So for us, it's hard sometimes to embrace a technological approach that doesn't have that same ability to evolve, to continue to grow, to continue to change. So finding this kind of a relationship partnership like we have with you, where we're learning, you're learning, you're growing services for us, and we're able to continue to evolve and technologically in the most effective way, is really valuable. I think, let me go back more to your question though. There is a lot of recognition that the pandemic highlighted a very, very deep inequity around technology. And as a person that has very strong opinions, probably more opinion than expertise, you know, I and some friends and many others have talked about technology and the need for it to be a public good. That if we rely on technology for education, for employment opportunities, for employment, we've been all working virtually for months. We can't have it that only people with resources have access. And there have been some great efforts in trying to address that. But the reality is the equity is deep. The inequity is deep, and that there are a lot of people that still don't have the resources they need. So I would say that there's a couple of pieces. We want to leverage technology and we can expand our reach, but we also need larger efforts that make sure all young people have access to the technology they need to be able to benefit from it. So education will likely have elements of virtual ongoing. Everybody's going to continue with some elements of virtual after the pandemic, for the most part. Maybe not everybody, but most companies, most nonprofits. We need to take this moment in time to think about how we do that with an equitable lens, and we really think about all young people. So we now are able to leverage technological resources from agencies, universities that aren't even in our area. You know, so it's really opened a door on the tools that we can integrate into our work in new and exciting ways. So I think that's going to be one of the continued evolutions that we see here.
That's great, awesome job, Karen. Like with all the technology around, we could impact more lives, which is which is for public good, which you rightly mentioned. So thanks a lot for sharing your thoughts, especially leveraging technology during this tough time. And what do you suggest, or your advice for other nonprofits who are listening to this, or who are around US, who are trying to build these kind of robust youth workforce development programs, if they are just thinking about it, or if they have wanted to do similar programs like Youth Job Center and they're just getting started, what's your advice to them?
So there are so many strong, effective agencies out there. I would say learn from some of the agencies that are doing the work and copy paste. I think that there are some really great efforts. I think one of the challenges we face in the nonprofit world is not enough collaboration. I think we need to do more stronger collaborations across workforce development. I also think, and there's some work happening in different areas around this, I think workforce development should be embraced by employers more. And so really thinking about how employers are not viewing workforce development as either a place to hire someone or unfortunately, sometimes a charity lens, like we're going to support this nonprofit that does this social service work. Rather, we should be partnering to think about strategic workforce development. How does your company need to grow? How do you need to build your workforce? What are the skills you need? What are the competencies you need? How do we figure those out together? And how do we help you build and keep your workforce of the future? So I think that I think there's many ways to be really strategic as workforce development agencies. And I think we need to shift our identity too, to be much more strategic around building a workforce across all companies.
Great advice, Karen. Thanks a lot for sharing that. Such a wonderful thought to collaboratively work with employers from a different angle to be very strategic partners in the communities all around the US and beyond. So now my last and final question to you is, where could people come to learn more about Youth Job Center and the great work that you and your team are doing in Evanston and beyond across the Chicago area?
Well, I welcome anyone contacting me, and my contact info is on the website. Our URL is youthjobcenter.org. We have multiple locations in Chicagoland area and opportunities to join virtually pretty much most weeks. So we would love to have anybody contact us that's interested. There's also our whole staff directory there if people have specific questions. There's an info@youthjobcenter.org. So just pepper us with questions. We're happy for that.
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing your contact information, Karen. You're truly one of the persons that are driven by doing. Thanks a lot for sharing your story and the great work that Youth Job Center is doing. I'm sure a lot of folks who are listening to your story and Youth Job Center would definitely reach back to you to learn more about your organization. Any final words?
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I really enjoyed this.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot. And listeners, please do subscribe to Driven by Doing podcast to listen to wonderful other guests in the future. Thanks a lot.